A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to Films I Should Have Talked About Years Ago. So here's another pick that I was able to figure out that apparently exists. One that I feel like that some people might have forgotten about, but in all honesty, why would you forget about something like this? You could think of this exact film, San Andreas, from 2015, as sort of like a remake to Earthquake, even though it's almost completely unrelated in a way. Because first of all, there are indeed some connections that I'm pretty much finding between Earthquake and this. First of all, if you're ever familiar with Universal, there was a ride simply titled Earthquake. And in 2008, it was referred to as Disaster, a major motion picture event starring you. And Dwayne Johnson was actually at this event on opening day, pretty much. The grand opening of this thing had Dwayne Johnson in it. So it's no surprise that San Andreas brings a lot of connections to Earthquake. So, I don't really know what else to say about that. But you know what though? I will say that in its own rights, San Andreas is a pretty good film. Not necessarily a masterpiece by any means. It would take a lot more than just simply showcasing some amazing visual effects, plus some unique sound design and some incredible action hero-esque scenes to call it a masterpiece. It would take a lot more than just all that. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, however, I really have to say, has starred in so many films in the past decade that it's almost crazy. I tell you, if I could mention a lot of these things off the top of my head, I've talked about Doom 2005 some time ago, but we also can't forget that there was Fast and the Furious, Hobbs and Shaw, Jungle Cruise, which came out not too long ago as a re-release after its July 2020 original release. And then we also can't forget the new Jumanji films, so that's two of them, as it was a duology from 2017 to 2019. And then of course there was Skyscraper, and then the likes of Central Intelligence, and who could forget this. So I don't see any surprise here knowing that Dwayne Johnson is really such a big actor these days, but when you really look at it this way, this is one of those mere examples that tends to show some of the lesser known, yet more intriguing parts of Johnson's career. A 2015 film of this sort really does have a lot to show for it. But again, I can never stop thinking about Earthquake, as there's just so much in relation to this. It's just almost a mere coincidence, pretty much. But moving forward, I will go ahead and talk a bit about San Andreas. This is basically an Earthquake-style film. Dwayne Johnson basically plays an air chopper rescue soldier of some sorts. I don't really know how exactly you'd call them. But anyways, it does seem that a relationship going on in the family would call for a divorce. But Johnson knows that work would come first. Because, according to some people out there in the local university inside the areas of California, you have yourself people who are studying different earthquakes and different fault lines. It turns out that there's the San Andreas fault, which is canonically explained about how it's basically a certain shape and there are certain fault lines in the lake that seem to be shifting. The whole plot line itself can be rather complex and therefore confusing, difficult to understand, and all that good stuff, but I myself am doing my best here to explain it as much as possible, because it's probably no wonder why this film might not have been as good as most others. And despite performing average in the box office, I don't necessarily know how else to critique on this point here. But maybe because it's a lot more recent in comparison with other average box office result films out there that are now being referred to as all-time masterpieces, I guess that's just kind of what happens when you have millennials who live with you all the time. They call these films masterpieces even though most people these days weren't even alive when those years pretty much came and went. But San Andreas, being a much more recent example of a film that can perform average in the box office, probably doesn't necessarily have the kind of, well, things that it is. I was 16 at the time. I never saw this film in theaters. I was only able to thanks to HBO Max alongside many other big examples here. So, all in all, I will mention this though. The effects here are certainly stunning. The kind of film techniques they use, based on other disaster films that we've seen, like The Day After Tomorrow, Armageddon, Deep Impact, or possibly even Twister. I mean, those were pretty good films, but above all that, I will mention real quickly that, well, the plotline really does give quite a lot of ways to try and get rid of the characters as soon as possible. There are so many disastrous portions of the film that it's almost overwhelming. It makes the disaster points of the film seem like normal parts of the film, like normal person-to-person dialogue sort of pieces right there. The amount of scenes where you see buildings crumble, dams collapsing, or windows crashing, or vehicles exploding, or choppers landing on the ground, I tell you, there's certainly lots of things about this film that just make it seem like it's a normal thing nowadays. Well, that's mostly because these are natural disasters. These are things that we've come to terms with. And I honestly have to mention that this seems to be just a mere example of what an earthquake would actually have a potential of appearing as if you were to be able to see one yourself in real life. So, I will say though that it's still a pretty good film nonetheless, because it's Dwayne Johnson. I guess that's just the sucker front that I happen to be a part of nowadays, especially because I've known Dwayne Johnson, especially at a very young age. And I'm still a pretty darn big die-hard fan of the kind of stuff that Johnson's done. I tell you, if only I were able to get up to that sort of level on many fronts. Well, anyways, it's time to go ahead and give this film a scoring here. And I will say that for Dwayne Johnson, playing a rather brave individual out there on the set of a film that's about all sorts of things crumbling around you, the entire world collapsing under the brinks of a bunch of shock waves released by fault lines on the tectonic plates, is a pretty amazing move right there. It's not necessarily masterpiece quality, but San Andreas does itself deserve a scoring of 7.5 out of 10. So not necessarily much higher or lower. I'm willing to go on all fronts. Even if I were able to watch it a second time, I probably will not necessarily get the same kind of feeling that I initially did. I was rather surprised that a film would actually go so far to try and give as much insight on how epic and as a disaster would actually be. But seeing that we've had earthquakes in the past, and they're nothing too special, real life encounters would be even worse. But at least this film happens to be satirical. At the same time, it tries to be entertaining, exciting, and believable by any means. So that's probably just it that I have for all that. So if you want to see more, go down on my channel. Then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.